Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Charney. I'm the Dean at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And I'd like to welcome you to our webinar in honor of Valentin Fuster. And the title of our webinar is Enhancing Cardiovascular Health Throughout the Lifespan. We're going to wait a minute or two until everybody is joining our webinar. Okay, we're going to get started. And first, I want to introduce our guest of honor, Valentin Fuster. I know Valentin, for a long time. We're colleagues, we're close friends, and everything I'm going to say is the truth. I think he's the most eminent cardiologist in the world. He's not only a spectacular clinician, and he cares deeply about his patients. In fact, at one point I was dealing with something and he called me every day. I had to tell him, stop calling me. I'm okay. He's also an outstanding researcher. His research has helped millions of people in terms of a better understanding of cardiovascular disease that has led to the development of new treatments. And he's an incredible mentor. He has mentored hundreds of cardiologists that are now leaders in their own right. So the span of Dr. Fuster's influence on cardiology, cardiac patients around the world is unmatched. So we're going to start first with a video, and then I'll be back right after the video to introduce our speakers.
Dr. Valentin Fuster has demanded that no worthy effort go uninvestigated as we seek to understand, prevent, and treat all manner of heart conditions. In recognition of Dr. Valentin Fuster's unparalleled lifelong dedication to cardiology research, the American College of Cardiology recently established a prestigious new research award named in his honor, the Valentin Fuster Award for Innovation and Science. Over the next 15 years, this annual award will be given to a physician who is a champion of scientific research, embraces scientific inquiry, and seeks innovative ways to improve patient care. We have only just begun to create a global culture of combating cardiovascular disease. The VF100 campaign will accelerate our work and provide greater opportunities to extend Dr. Valentin Fuster's research excellence to all at Mount Sinai Heart. With your support, the VF100 campaign will honor Dr. Valentin Fuster while continuing to drive this innovation in basic, clinical, and translational cardiovascular research. Through your generosity, Mount Sinai Heart's audacious research in all areas of cardiovascular health will remain crucial into the future.
Just to note, the VF100 campaign is Mount Sinai's ambition to raise $100 million to honor Valentin Fuster's legacy, so that for many years we continue to conduct the research that will change the lives of millions of patients with cardiovascular disease, to train the next generation of cardiologists who will have impact around the world. So let me mention who are going to be the speakers for today's event. First, you're going to hear from Dr. Fuster, and then you're going to hear from Dr. Miriam Murad, who's director of the Lipschultz Precision Immunology Institute. You will hear from Philip Sversky, who's the director of our Cardiovascular Research Institute. And then finally, you will hear from Dr. Saeed Fayed, who's the director of our Biomedical Engineering and Imaging Institute. Valentin, let's start with your talk.
First of all, thank you very much, Dennis, for your introduction. at least what we learned from your introduction is what real friendship is all about. Thank you very much. Well, things are changing in the world of science very rapidly. Up until now, we have been all very much focused in understanding disease. And maybe we understand disease much better than we understand health. And the question is why we don't focus our attention in health before disease. And this is the title of my presentation today. Development and innovation in cardiovascular health is an age-dependent program with new technology. If you are in the bottom of the slide, you can see the #1 killer today. Here is an artery that has cholesterol inside and is closing, may lead to a heart attack or to a stroke. So why we don't move to the top of the slide and we try to study how this process begins and to prevent the disease, the ultimate disease. That's #1. I mentioned age dependent. It's quite different to talk about health on an individual from birth to age 20, between age 20 and 60, and between age 60 and 100. The challenges, as you will see in a moment, are quite different. But even further, if we are going to move into how the disease develops, the so-called atherosclerotic disease of the arteries, if we are going to move there, we should use the most modern technology available. Very much we have been in the field of imaging and genomics, but artificial intelligence is important. They look at single cells, either in an atherosclerotic plaque or in the circulating blood, may tell us about a lot of information about us. And finally, new therapies. And the new therapies that are evolving, interestingly, many of them are focused on defense mechanisms that defend us from disease in a healthy state. Can we enhance these defense mechanisms? Let's find out what are these defense mechanisms. A clear example are the vaccines. MicroRNA, for a long time, we have been talking about as being the result of diseases of different types. But it's a defense mechanism as it has been portrayed by the vaccination using mRNA to enhance that defense mechanism. And this is how the vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna were actually developed. So I'm going to now talk to you about the 3 challenges. And let me start between age 20 and age 60. Those of you who have this age, I will tell you, from our point of view, the most important question is, I am developing the disease that is the #1 killer, because this is a very silent disease. Let's just focus into that. Next, please. Here you have the risk factors for heart attacks and strokes that occlude the arteries leading to these events. 2 of the factors are actually, I would call physical. Obesity on the left, blood pressure on the right. 2 are chemical. Diabetes, as you can see in the top right, and high cholesterol. And then 3 are more behavioral: smoking, lack of exercise on the top, and in the middle, this obese person, there's something else. Maybe he's eating poorly, maybe he's sleeping poorly. And on the top, we have genetics. All of these risk factors, just leaving genetics aside, appear to injure the artery that is in the bottom that supplies blood to the heart and to the brain. And as this artery, the layer inside, is injured by these risk factors, cholesterol penetrates. And you can see there in the middle, in the bottom, in yellow, the cholesterol deposition. And then this is how the plaque begins to evolve. Next, please. Well, the question is, how can we understand, or how can we know if those of you aged 20 to 60 are developing a disease that is silent and you don't know about it? So over the last 10 years, we have developed new technologies of imaging, external imaging, without injecting anything, in which we look at the arteries, first the 2 arteries that supply blood to the brain, the carotid arteries, then the main artery that leaves the heart, the aorta, And then the arteries that supply blood to the legs, the iliofemoral arteries, the large arteries of the body. And then to look at the coronary arteries, we use something indirect, which is the deposition of calcium in those arteries, that we can do this with external imaging. Well, what we have learned, first of all, here on the left, in the first box that you see in red, there is a small plaque with the arrow that is beginning to evolve with cholesterol deposition in an artery of the leg. In the second is the longitudinal beginning of the plaque. But then all these people that we have studied between age 40 and 55, 4,000 people, the disease continues to develop. And on the right, you can see in this number 3 box, how the plaque that at the beginning was very small on the left is larger, and so the longitudinal plaque that you see in the box of the right. So what we have learned actually is the following. First, the disease begins in the legs, in the artery that supply blood to the legs. And it's interesting, it's not because we develop symptoms there, because the arteries are so large that in order to be occluded and develop symptoms is difficult. This is why the coronary artery is so easy, is the first manifestation of disease, because they are small. Second, this disease subclinically starts at a very young age. 75% of men under the age of 50, we found in this 4,000 group, had already subclinical disease under the age of 50. And actually women, 50% of women have already subclinical disease before age 50. So it's a disease that is silent and unfortunately begins at a young age. But there is more than that. We are following these people for 20 years now. And I will tell you, the first time that we did how the disease was 4 years after the original study, in 41% at 4 years was already the disease was progressing. And therefore, we are dealing with a disease at the very early age, unfortunately silent, we don't know we have it, and continues to progress if the risk factors that I mentioned are not being taken care of. But there is another aspect next, a very important one you are going to hear later from my colleagues, inflammation. What basically happens here, we have a defense mechanism against this cholesterol that is deposited by the risk factors. And the question is, what is this defense mechanism? These are cells that actually are released from the bone marrow called macrophages, and there is a war. The macrophages go after the cholesterol that is deposited in the arteries. And here what we have on the right is a new imaging technology we call positron emission tomography, that it shows in yellow the fight of the macrophages that try to absorb this excess of cholesterol and the cholesterol in itself. We see this, we have done this in 900 people. Very interesting. Who is the winner? In general, the winner is the macrophage from the bone marrow. We call an inflammation being the winner. And here on the left, the winning context is that this artery that has cholesterol inside finally becomes fibrotic and is the end of this story. A winning context in the early development of the disease. This all looks very nice, but if you continue to smoke, if you continue not to treat your blood pressure, if you continue with your high cholesterol, diabetes is not treated, you are not exercising, all of these, what's happening is that the deposition of cholesterol continues. And there's this foreign body is so large that when the bone marrow response says, I cannot do my job, the defense mechanism fails. We call this a suicide of the defense mechanism, these inflammatory cells. And this is number 2, is in red, because the war is lost. And you know what happened? During this suicide, these cells actually release substances that are very toxic. They make the plaques of atherosclerotic disease to break. They release factors that create blood clots. And this is what is a heart attack and a stroke is a failure of a defense mechanism because we didn't take care of our risk factors and the cholesterol keeps entering until there is this suicidal event called apoptotic phenomena. What about genetics? Very fascinating. We all have been working on this, but what happened is this motor engine of these cells has to work very well to defend ourselves. But if some of the genes of this motor engine are mutated, are abnormal, the motor engine doesn't work. And this is actually a very interesting new development. It's called CHIP, and I don't want to get into the details, are cells released from the bone marrow that genetically are not healthy. Then the defense mechanism gets there when cholesterol begins to deposit it. But with these genes being altered, there is no motor engine of defense. So here what I am describing are the three mechanisms very important of defense and makes us to be healthy. The first, risk factors, be sure we stop them. Otherwise, this defense mechanism that is a winner will become a suicidal, and we lose the battle and events take place. And then finally, very genetically abnormal individuals may have the motor engine not working, and there is not that there is more or less cholesterol, it's just not working. A very important concept. And actually next, we published this last week. In fact, Dr. Swirsky wrote an editorial comment, and that actually was very, very nice of him to do it. And this is basically the bone marrow of our individuals, young individuals, apparently healthy, that reacts. You see here? And now, next, in the left, the blue there. Next, please. And here is in the artery. This is the yellow situation where the cells of the bone marrow and the cholesterol are already on the fight. And this is actually what we just published. Next slide, please. Well, what to do? What about the behavior of these people between age, in this case, 20 and age 55? Well, let me give you three examples we found very striking. First of all, you decide not to eat breakfast because you want to lose weight. And then you eat a breakfast of less than 5% of the total calorie that you need on a daily basis. Do you know what we find? Look in the bottom of the slide where this circle, red circle, has the blue. More subclinical disease if you don't have a good breakfast. Why? We think that these people eat more and more later on. This is a theory, but this is the reality. Next slide, please. Here is a very interesting aspect, actually, and that is people who socialize constantly at night. We have in the left Mediterranean diet, in the Middle Western diet, and the right we call social business. You go at night and you eat and you drink and so forth. We found in this circle much more subclinical disease in this social business dinner that is frequent than the people who actually take care of themselves with an appropriate diet and eating on the right times. And now the most striking feature, sleep. Next. Look at this. Here on the left, you have actually the sleeping patterns, and on the ordinate here on the vertical axis is people who develop the subclinical disease. You see more and more if you sleep less than 6 hours. Well, is this all? Not at all. Some people may sleep 10 hours, but it's completely broken the sleep on and off, on and off, on and off, the same thing. So what we are finding is our normal daily life, no breakfast, going at night every night. Maybe I am doing an extremist, but I'm putting this just for the importance. And then sleeping poorly, bad news for the coronary arteries and for your health. Next slide, please. And this leads to these people at this age to the second interesting concept. And that is, we see many people who have an LDL cholesterol that is normal. Do you know what the LDL cholesterol is? The good cholesterol. In the guidelines is between 100 and 120 milligrams per DL. And this is all done in people over age of 40 and people who they look at heart attacks. Well, we did it differently. We have with this new technology that, by the way, we are the only group in the world that has this technology in a long longitudinal study, I have to say, we found that subclinical disease actually begins already with LDL cholesterols of less than 70 milligrams DL. This is a problem. Well, you might be told you are pre-diabetic. Hemoglobin A1C between 5.5 and 6%. And they say, this is an alarm because you may get diabetes and you may have a risk of developing heart attacks and strokes. I will tell you, this is not an alarm. This is the development of subclinical disease. We have found exactly the same thing. What is considered close to normal is not when you have the imaging technology that tells you what is going on silently. And this is not on the guidelines. The guidelines is with heart attacks and strokes. They don't pay attention to what goes on subclinically. And the same with triglycerides. So next slide. So this led us to develop the first study ever done in young people in looking at what I am presenting to you. This is the so-called pre-cut trial that we are now designing. Is individuals between age 20 to 40 with an LDL cholesterol that by all the guidelines is normal, but for us is not, more than 70 milligrams DL, are going to be randomized on the right to a very aggressive approach to drop the LDL below actually 60 or 50 milligrams DL. And on the left of the slide is the usual of guidelines, take care of the risk factors. So primitive, so out of touch, that you have to really move with the science, with new technologies, as I mentioned at the beginning. Well, the study is going to be a 5 to 10 year study, and we plan to show, and I certainly, this is our hypothesis, that treating aggressively subclinical disease not to start at young age is going to be successful. This is basically the key of the study. Next slide, please. Well, I mentioned to you what is the challenge between age 20 and 60 years. We have the technology, and in fact, we are now going to countries that actually socioeconomically, they are actually poor countries, and we can use the device just looking at the legs. Because if you develop the disease there, it's going to extend. This is a systemic disease. So it's going to be this automatized in the next 2 years, and we will be able to tell you how many cubic millimeters of atherosclerotic disease and cholesterol deposition is in your body. It will be all automatically in the next couple of years, but we already began with the legs in trying to be this affordable to everybody. What is the challenge between age 60 and 100 years? It's your brain. It's not you want to live longer or shorter, it's your brain working. Next slide, please. And I have a single slide to give you this story. We have a transatlantic study between Mount Sinai in New York and a center of research in Spain, the so-called TransNib study. And let me tell you what we are doing. We are doing people who have cognitive dysfunction, and we measure the arteries, the large arteries, where there is disease there or not, and risk factors. And on the other hand, we get people that the disease in the large arteries, then we go into the brain, we look at cognitive function and how the imaging of the brain is. This is a brain. All the technology I mentioned to you, now we have it available in the brain. And let me tell you what we learned in the first 300 individuals, 150 from here and 150 from Madrid, Spain. 5 things. First, the risk factors affect the large arteries. I have been already talking about. Second, with magnetic resonance imaging, if the risk factors, particularly 3, hypertension, high cholesterol, and diabetes, are not taken care of, the perfusion of the brain decreases. We have already published this. Number 3, as the brain perfusion decreases, but we think a disease that develops in the microvascular of the brain by the same risk factors that affect the large arteries, now what we find, less glucose uptake in the brain. So we are affecting the nutrition of the cells of the brain. And we believe that a lot of senile dementia is cognitive decline because the same risk factors that lead to heart attacks and strokes are affecting the microvascular of the brain. But I have more to say. We have an animal model of Alzheimer's disease. And what we have seen is this process of progression of disease by risk factors maybe accelerate the Alzheimer's disease, but most importantly, L-amyloid is prothrombotic. What we find in the animal model is there is a small clots of L-amyloid which enters into the brain and causes Alzheimer's. And you say, what are you talking about? Everybody's looking at the cells of the brain. Let me tell you what Alzheimer's disease 120 years ago. My disease, he was a pathologist, is a vascular disease. So my question is, why all these 100 years, all the research has been confined to the cells of the brain because this cognitive dysfunction, without realizing that a trigger, important trigger, comes from the circulating blood. And this is actually what we are doing. And I think this is very fascinating line of research, which is part one, what I presented to you. Part two is different. It's the same individuals that have been to stage one, we are following them for actually 20 years with the different technologies. Here are not the same individuals who had this first phase and phase number 5 were different. What this helped us is to build up the hypothesis. Well, now I'm going to finish. Next slide. What is the challenge between age birth and age 20? The challenge is not whether I have disease or not. The challenge is not how my brain works. The challenge is, can I prevent what I presented to you? And this is becoming obvious that we are missing the game, is the young people. Next slide. And here it turns out that I began to work with Sesame Street, a program of education that you might know in television. And one of the first things I decided to contribute to with other people, I was not the main investigator here, was to change Cookie Monster. Rather than eating cookies 7 days a week, just 1 day a week. And you know what? It was an incredible success. Now Sesame has changed its philosophy. It's now working on disease, on illness. It's working in malaria, HIV, Chagas. That's what the educational program is all about. We took advantage, and we already had evidence 5 years ago that in fact the brain of children between age 3 and 5 years have very few centers, and therefore anything you tell a child is recorded. However, if you go to adult ages, there are many centers, and it's very chaotic. You don't listen, or you have a mixed up, and you don't capture this so readily. This is why children, they may manifest when they are adults what they were in their age 3 to 6, the environment that they live. And to me, this is fascinating. Look at yourselves, and you will see how you are today, how much has to do with the exposure that you had at that particular age. Next slide, please. Well, we took this very seriously, and we began a huge program of 5,000 children, Bogota, in Madrid, and in Harlem, New York. 60 hours of teaching how the body works. The child needs to know about the body before you talk about obesity. Then healthy food habits, physical activity, and how to control the emotions. And that is to prepare these children when actually they are confronted with alcohol, drugs, etc. This project of 60 hours is for a period of 6 months. And the results, I don't have to present to you, were fascinating. And in fact, this is all published. And actually, we couldn't get into this project in the United States because at the beginning with the Board of Education, they say, you don't have to tell us anything. Well, this is how I started in Bogota, Madrid. And when they saw all these publications, they call us and says, you can start in New York. Well, this is the story, how it evolved. Next slide, please. And now we have 2 big projects. And we already started in the 5 boroughs of New York. And that is each borough has socioeconomic levels, high, low, disparities, more or less. What we are measuring here is the index of cardiovascular health, all the risk factors I mentioned, and we begin with children between age 3 and 6 years. And this is knowledge, attitude, and health. These are the endpoints. But we are looking at what? At the family. We are looking what motivates the teacher. We look at the environment, about pollution, etc., and certainly sustainability, because what we are learning in all the projects is you have to reintervene again and again. We found this in the adult population, and we found this in children. And our hypothesis is the reintervention will have exponential benefit as compared with an intervention that is done only once. This is actually in New York City. Next. And here we have the project that is the final one I want to mention, Family University. We decided that the issue of health is an issue of culture. If you can develop the culture, not in your children only, in the preschool system, but in the family, this would be a way to go. And we have developed this program. It's going to start very soon, and basically has the same 60 hours that I mentioned in terms of knowledge of how the body works, promote physical activity, health food habits, encourage better management of emotions, goes to the whole family. And this is the story. Next slide, please. It's a year project. The four items are presented, each of them for 2 weeks. Grandparents, parents, children, and grandchildren. They are different for the different groups. And then we go into sustainability again and again, maturing. We have worked for 2 years in these programs and are fascinating. And we are going to start, actually, the first center will be a research center in Madrid for the investigators' family. And then we are coming to New York, which there are many people that are aware of this. And at the very end, next slide, we'll give a diploma, which is Family University of Health, Dr. Rooster. This is a map that carries my name on, but that's what it is. And we will sign the program as the family is certified. This is a culture what we are talking about. Final slide, please. And finally, let me tell you, what we have done up until now is to do secondary prevention. After a heart attack and a stroke, we do the best we can. Very costly. Great part of the cost today is hospitalizations late when we were too late. What we have to do is to go much earlier, where there are maximal potential benefit and the lowest risk. And here I finish by saying, better we pay attention to children. And today I gave grand rounds actually to the Department of Pediatrics here at Mount Sinai. And the title actually was the children in their age is the golden mind today when we try to promote health. Anyway, thank you very much to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rooster. I got 2 brief questions, and then we'll move on to Dr. Murad. One, and I kind of fit myself into this category. How does, if you are somebody who exercises a lot, can that overcome a bad diet? Or do you really, in terms of cardiovascular risk, or do you have to pay attention to both?
You overcome in part. And in fact, this is where the guidelines, there is from red to yellow to green. And that is, it depends. I can assure you that if you exercise and you, for example, have high blood pressure or overweight, the exercise certainly helps, that not to be this so atrocious in a way. So anything you can do on a risk factor out of the 7 will always look better from the prognostic point of view. But I want to emphasize one thing, Dennis, and that is, please, it starts with your grandchildren, your 8 grandchildren. Start at that age, under the age of 7, because that's the time that they will be good for mid-age and will be good for their brains when they are older.
Okay, so when they ask for ice cream, I'm going to tell them, Dr. Rooster said, no, can't have that ice cream.
We have, by the way, 24 movies of Rooster, how he does cardiopulmonary resuscitation and so forth. So the family project has a lot of movies from the Muppets.
Okay, good. All right, thank you. So we're going to move on now to Dr. Miri Murad, who is one of the most eminent researchers in the world as it relates to immunology and its the effects of immune function on multiple diseases, as you'll see on that slide. Dr. Murad is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, which is one of the most prestigious awards you can get in the research in biomedical science. So, Dr. Murad, we look forward to your talk.
Okay, so thank you, Dennis. But I also want to acknowledge Dr. Fuster's contribution to science, because despite all the successes that he had in science and in the clinic, he really continues to fight forcefully to enhance our understanding of cardiovascular disease and identify new paths for treatment and prevention. So Dr. Fuster, you are a model of engagement for us all, and it's really inspiring any age of this career of ours. And thank you for leading the way. So here, so the reason I'm here is because we have realized that in recent years that the immune system and the inflammatory response that this immune system provides is really contributing to virtually all human diseases. So beyond its key role in protecting against microbes, as the whole world learned during COVID, the immune system contributes to disease beyond those that are driven by a dysregulated immune system. So for example, allergy or autoimmunity. So we know that the immune system and this inflammatory response that is driven by this immune system is contributing to cancer, but also aging, but also Alzheimer's disease and even depression. And today I'm going to talk to you about this explosion of data showing that even in atherosclerosis, which initially was thought to be driven really by this excess of lipid, we know that these lipids are not driving the plaque themselves. The lipid is really driving an inflammatory response, and this inflammatory response is contributing to damaging the vessels. After myocardial infarction is the same. There is a big inflammatory response that is triggered upon cell death. And this we know has a major contribution to disease outcome. So in animal models, if you block one subset of immune cells, we know that you can improve disease outcome. But we know also that there is a group of immune cells that are going to contribute to repairing, to protecting the heart. So it's really becoming very important to understand the contribution of these immune cells to disease outcome. And this is what I've been doing for more than 20 years. But the biggest next, I think there's an animation here, but the biggest revolution, I think, in medicine in the last decades is the realization that drugging that immune system can be curative. Next. So for example, we know that vaccines, right, which is really driving an immune response against a microbe, was able to stop the pandemic. Next, there is now an extraordinary new treatment in cancer, which is called checkpoint blockade or immunotherapy. Checkpoint blockade and CAR T cells, and this is a treatment that is based only on activation of the immune system, and activating the immune system can change cancer outcome, even in very advanced cancer. Next. And then there are an explosion of new drugs that can block some inflammatory molecule that are transforming many diseases. So for example, rheumatoid arthritis or inflammatory bowel disease or psoriasis or atopic dermatitis now can be treated by these antibody, by a new drug that just block the release of inflammatory molecule. So the question that we have together with Dr. Fuster, Dr. Swisley, Dr. Fayyad, and many others is, can we identify immune drugs that can help treat or prevent cardiovascular damage? Next slide. So I didn't show you this, but the immune system is very complex. It's a complex network of cells, and some cells are producing inflammatory molecules, some cells are blocking the release of inflammatory molecules. So it is, and this is why it's been difficult to really understand the contribution of the system in disease. It's also a very dynamic system. So there is an activation and regulation, activation. So to really understand it, it was quite complex, and it was really the focus of experts. However, now there have been an explosion of technology that enables us to really understand the complexity of the system. And in fact, at Sinai, we have made, visionary investment in technology to really understand this wiring of the immune system. And we've done that much before many institutions, in fact, thanks to Dennis, because we realized that if we really wanted to understand this immune system, we had to really go and study human disease and get away from the animal model. And so what we did is we started to really optimize technology that will allow us to visualize disease lesions or this atherosclerosis plaque, for example, and Dr. Fayyad is going to talk about this. But me in my center, I started to optimize technology that will enabled me to understand the molecular program of these immune cells at the single cell level. And we brought this to Sinai, developed it, expanded, and now are using it to study human lesions. And in fact, this platform, which we call the Human Immune Monitoring Center, is now next being used by many, had been largely funded and recognized, by several NIH consortia. I think there is several. Can you click one more time? Okay, so it's been used, for example, and funded by the Cancer Moonshot, used by and funded by this Human Immunology Project Consortia, the Human Cell Atlas, big consortia to study, in fact, different diseases in the body. Next slide. So, so recently what we did is we decided to use that technology platform that I just described to really understand the immune cell composition and program that are present populating this atherosclerosis plaque. So no one has done that before. And what we did is we teamed up with vascular surgeons, and we collected that plaque, lesional plaque, this piece of vessels that is very damaged, and we brought it to this technology platform. And we asked, how are these immune cells, in fact, organized? And we took, in fact, different group of patients. We took patients that had a plaque that had developed some ischemic event, which we call a symptomatic plaque, and patients that had a plaque but never had any symptoms. And we spent a lot of time analyzing it through all these different technology here. So I'm not going to go into detail because it's quite technical, but we generated a large amount of data. And what we find a very, very interesting, in fact, results. So for example, we also, based on animal models, that the immune cell that will be accumulating in these vessels were cells called macrophages. These cells have been studying for a long time. Well, it turned out that there is a whole other, well, Dr. Fuster had predicted it, but a whole subset of immune cells called the lymphocytes. You may have heard about them now that everyone is becoming a bit of an immunologist since COVID. And those lymphocytes really have no role to play there, but it suggests that maybe there is, it looks like an autoimmune response. And some patients have developed potentially some autoimmunity against maybe some lipid antigen. So this is what we are discovering. We are discovering the wiring. We are discovering that there is different pattern between patients. And we are also discovering, different organization. But more importantly, we are potentially discovering pathways that we can block to reduce the progression of these plaques. Next slide. So this is exactly what we are doing now. We are trying to first hypothesize about what we call pathogenic pathways, so pathways that are driving these atherosclerosis lesions. Next, then we are going to go into animal model and test this hypothesis. But the testing is really based on what we are seeing in patients. Next, so in this animal model, we are going to look whether some pathway can indeed reduce plaque progression. And when we have potentially identified some potential drug that could work in patients, next, we will test them in patients. And again, these patients will then be studied using this platform next. I think I bring them back to this technology platform. So we will then examine whether, our hypothesis is right? Whether that pathway can indeed reduce the progression of these plaques. And then finally, and I will say even more importantly, what we want to do is, next slide, is to now identify, using again this technology platform, driver of atherosclerosis progression, so or cardiovascular disease in general. And this will be done because together with Dr. Fuster's program. So the idea is that now we will use all the technology and potentially probe some of the hypotheses that we've observed in full-blown atherosclerosis lesions, bring it, to this cohort of individuals that we will follow over time. And then we will examine, can we identify biological markers that suggest that patients are going to progress? And if this is the case, can we intervene? And again, we will use that technology to really measure whether these prevention or preventive therapy are indeed functional, right? So we'll have markers, and this marker will be biological, but also radiological. So our dream really is that in our checkup at the age of, let's say, 25, we will be routinely identifying, or we will be testing, routinely for a risk factor of progression. And this, will enable us to be put on specific preventive therapy to really halt the progression of any potential cardiovascular disease. All right, I'm done with my part.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murad. Yeah, one of the goals of research at Mount Sinai, which we are uniquely positioned to accomplish, is that our researchers, not only aspire to get grants and publish in top journals, but that the research, makes a difference, that it gets into the lives of our patients, it changes the lives of our patients. And what you've heard from, Dr. Fuster, is many approaches that can change the course of cardiovascular disease in fundamental ways. In Dr. Murad's talk, she is emphasizing new ideas, new approaches using immunotherapy to treat cardiovascular disease and also change the course. So my question to Dr. Murad is, how far away are we to develop new medicines, new approaches using our knowledge of immunology to develop novel new treatments for cardiovascular disease?
But I just want to, just second what you've said about this integration of basic science into the clinic, and the uniqueness of our center. And maybe Phil Swirsky, who came from a very established place, can attest to this. I think, and I don't know why this is, but maybe because we built a research center around our hospital. We are first a hospital, and then we built this research center on, maybe because of you, Dennis, who pushes us to really not focus on the real metrics. Basic science, yes, metrics are very clear. We want to publish these big papers, and we want to have these grants, and we want to be famous. But it's very difficult to bring basic science to the clinic because, clinic is much more heterogeneous. We don't have this reductionist, beautiful model that we work on. So to really cross the barrier, there is a cultural difference. And if the institution is not enabling that, so for example, enabling, bringing all this fantastic new technology very early on, then basic scientists will be a little bit intimidated, right, or fearful of really going and bringing this. And this is what Dr. Fuster and I think Dr. Chani really do, is bring those basic scientists, enabling us to go and understand the disease, and also reminding us that this is the only goal of what we do. Is one reason why we do this. It's not to publish in Nature, or not to have big grants, or not to have a fundraise, but it's to transform care. So I think there is a cultural, and really I have to say I'm very, very attached to this. I'm a foreigner. The reason why I stay here is because of this, because this possibility to really transform treatment. Now,
thank you.
Now immunotherapy, there is I think in my first slide, I was just saying, this revolution that is happening right now. There are hundreds and thousands of molecules that we can drug. We are right now drugging potentially 7 or 8 of them. The revolution is happening right now. There is extraordinary momentum. Phil Swirsky, Valentin, and Dr. Fuster and I have already very strong hypothesis of what immune molecule we are going to target in patients. There is already data that suggests that it is likely, very, very likely, that at least 2 inflammatory molecules, if blocked, can improve patients' outcome. So it is, and this is because this technology is allowing us to understand how it's wired. Before, we were not understanding the complexity. So there are many mistakes, not mistakes, maybe hypotheses were the wrong ones. Now we think that we can really come up with very strong hypotheses. And there is one that we want to push forward to the clinic, blocking this molecule, which we call IL-1 beta, which we think would be very beneficial. So I am very, very, very excited about the potential, as excited as I've ever been, since I started this, and many people know how excitable I am.
Thank you, and we're counting on you. So one of the major goals of the VF 100 is to come up with new treatments, and not new treatments, 20 years from now, but new treatments in which we can see the horizon. Our next speaker is Dr. Philip Sversky. Philip joined us within the last year. He's one of the outstanding basic and translational researchers focusing on cardiovascular health. He came to us from Harvard and Mass General, and already he's had a major impact on cardiovascular research at Mount Sinai. Philip?
And thank you, Dr. Charney. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. I will add that Dr. Fuster is a really inspirational figure, and I feel blessed that over this last year that I've been here at Sinai, I've got to know him a little better. So what I would like to do in the time I have is build a little bit on Dr. Fuster's and Murad's presentations and tell you a bit more about some of the scientific fundamental research taking place at Sinai that aims to better understand cardiovascular health throughout the lifespan. And I will link some of the ideas that I will discuss to the previous presentations. So what I would like to do first is contextualize this with a simple concept, and that is the concept that you see here on the screen, the concept of biological versus chronological age. Now, so what do we mean by chronological versus biological age? Chronological age is really what we celebrate every year we blow out our candles on our birthday. It is simply marking the passage of time. Now, biological age, on the other hand, is the age of our cells, our molecules, our organ systems. And one can imagine that chronological age and biological age may start the same, may sort of follow each other, but they can also diverge. Next slide, please. And the question really is, what can cause biological age and chronological age to diverge? There's no way that we can change chronological age, but we can somehow accelerate or slow down biological age. And it turns out that a major factor that influences biological age is lifestyle and the environment. The environments we inhabit voluntarily or involuntarily have a major impact on our biological age. Slide change, please. But as well as many lifestyle factors, many of the lifestyle factors that we engage in. And here you can see 4 such lifestyle factors that I'm stressing. So stress, sleep, diet, and exercise. And we are learning that these lifestyle factors really have a major impact on our biological age. And it is really how our systems, organs, cells, and molecules that they produce, how they change to our lifestyle, that is the key. And the idea here is that we can learn from nature. If we understand how we adapt to our environments, we can then find ways to prevent, mitigate, and in general, lend a helping hand to our biological aging. And so what I would like to do is really share with you 2 examples to really illustrate what am I talking about when I say that we need to study the role of a lifestyle factor on cardiovascular health. There's 3 examples here, diet and exercise, for example, Dr. Fuster already discussed. We are learning that it is important not just what we eat, but how we eat, when we eat, how much we eat. Exercise, of course, plays a major role on our cardiovascular health. But I would like to focus a little bit more on these other 2 factors, sleep and stress. Next slide. So let's talk about sleep. And let me illustrate to you the kind of work that we are doing that helps us understand how sleep can influence cardiovascular health. Next slide, please. So when we look at the body, next slide, it is very important for us to really understand what is happening in the brain when we sleep. The brain is very active when we sleep, and when that sleep is interrupted, either because we wake up every several minutes as a consequence of a number of factors that interrupt our sleep, or if our sleep is shortened or during jet lag. A number of these processes that happen in the brain are altered and are changed. Next slide. Next slide, or next. But we are also learning that the brain really talks to the rest of the body and regulates many of the processes that occur in the rest of the body. For example, processes that occur in the bone marrow. Now, the bone marrow is a birthplace of immune cells that Dr. Murad was talking about, these immune cells that we know are extraordinarily important in cardiovascular health. Next slide. And so by investigating what happens in the brain in response to sleep, how that controls these immune cells that are born in the bone marrow, we can then begin to understand how cardiovascular health is maintained under conditions of good sleep, and conversely, how under conditions of poor sleep, we see the breakdown and the emergence of cardiovascular disease. And we've seen this clinically and in a population level, as Dr. Fuster has shown. And here we are learning about what happens at the molecular, tissue, and cellular scales that can then allow us to potentially find drug targets, medicines that can be harnessed to mimic some of the beneficial effects of sleep. Next slide. So that's sleep. So let me now tell you, sort of give you another vignette concerning stress. Next slide. Now, stress is a very interesting and is very complicated because there is acute stress, there is chronic stress, and in many ways, stress first really starts with us recognizing it as stress, and that happens in the brain. And the question is, how do we go from the perception of stress that occurs in the brain, next slide, to what we know happens in the vessels and in the heart? We know that chronic stress propagates cardiovascular disease. We know that moments of extreme fear or of extreme acute stress can propagate a heart attack. And so the question is, how do we connect those dots? How do we go from how our brains understand stress to what happens in those vessels, in the heart, and in those atherosclerotic plaques? Next. And so what we are learning through the research that we're doing is that there are specific regions in the brain that talk to the rest of the body. Next. That induce large shifts and activate the large populations of immune cells that really participate in this process of inflammation that you heard from Dr. Murad. Next. That then cause these large migration patterns, large shifts from certain structures. This little kidney structure that you see here, that's not a kidney, that's a lymph node. A lymph node is a congregation, it's a place where immune cells meet and talk to each other and report about perhaps if there is a viral infection, if there is an injury, if there is high fats and high lipids. This is where a lot of the action happens. And what we're learning is that these brain structures really have a major impact on the migration of cells. Next. Which then can accumulate in the bone marrow. Next. But then we are also learning that other areas of the brain, in response to moments of acute stress, fear, or even chronic stress, talk to other regions in the body, for example, muscle. Next. And impart different types of migratory patterns that can directly influence cardiovascular disease. So again, this is about peering underneath the skin and complementing all that beautiful clinical work that we see, that we know give us very direct links between stress and cardiovascular disease, sleep and cardiovascular disease, exercise and cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular health, as well as diet, and really understand what happens at these tissue, molecular, and organ systems scales. And next. And so these are some of the key players that are important in this process. So with maybe the last 2 minutes, that I have, I just wanted to end with a little thought experiment. So imagine if there was a medicine that provides you with the cardiovascular and physiological equivalent of 7 to 9 hours of sleep, but it happens only in just 1 hour. Or imagine if there was a medicine that allows you to burn fat and lose weight at 5 times the rate for the same amount of exercise that you do. Or if there was a medicine that alleviates stress without any psychoactive effects, and while still doing so, prevents the damage to your heart and the brain that we know occurs with chronic stress or with acute stress. What if there's a medicine that works with your body systems and not against them? So we may not have some of these medicines, and some of it might sound like science fiction, but I would argue that if we adopt this roadmap, this concept of biological age, and really try to understand how the brain talks to the heart, how the various body systems talk to each other, with this framework, with this roadmap, we may be able to learn what nature has learned and harness some of these processes to improve our lives and keep us biologically young, even as time keeps on ticking. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. I'm still imagining. I'm looking for the magic pill.
It starts with the imagination, right?
Okay. We're counting on you to come up with those treatments. Thank you very much. So our last speaker is Dr. Zahi Fayed. He's the head of our Biomedical Engineering and Imaging Institute. Extremely creative, scientist, and he'll talk about how can wearables, which is a revolution in how we take care of ourselves, and continuous lifespan monitoring can alter disease and promote health. Zahi?
Thank you so much, Dennis. And so I have to say, I have been inspired first by Dr. Fuster when I was a graduate student more than 25 years ago. And I have been working with him for 25 years, and I remain extremely inspired. I'm also inspired by my colleagues, Phil Swirsky, Miriam Merad, and really also the vision, as you will see, that enables us to tackle these questions and imagine and find these solutions by Dennis Charney. So next. So we've heard the importance of using advanced tools. Dr. Fuster presented incredible technology to image in vivo, and I've been working with him, and his group have also in multiple places have innovated in this area. We've heard from Miriam the aspect of measuring things in the cells and trying to decipher things related to the immune system. And we've also heard from Phil, how can we mechanistically understand these very important lifestyle aspect that Dr. Fuster is challenging us to adopt and to adopt early. So we at Sinai have been really leaders in gathering these advanced technology to try to reach that goal. So we are integrating multimodal data that not only medical record, the omics, deep phenotyping, deep analysis that Phil and Miriam are doing. We ingest physiological monitoring when we see the patient. We do in-depth imaging. And more and more now we're trying to integrate, and we're integrating these mobile monitoring devices and using the power of analytics, data science, AI, machine learning, to try to come up with predictive model to figure out somebody's biological age, as Phil has said, but also try to prevent disease as we move forward. Next. So this monitoring is happening today, but it's really happening at a single time point when really the patient or the subject sees their doctor, either sees them in an outpatient clinic, sees them at the hospital, and you're collecting data, but this data is very much, in a sense, at that time of that visit. It doesn't really tell us or reveal to us the other secrets that the body is revealing to us. Next. We have seen now more and more the integration of devices, especially also pushed a lot by the COVID pandemic that forced this kind of interaction with the doctor to happen via what we call telehealth. So you provide to the patient, let's say, a pulse oximeter to try to see their respiratory rate, important during COVID, blood pressure, glucose, heart rate. You measure a scale. Even there are more and more now devices, pill boxes that are smart, that gives back the information to the physician. But these have been really, in a sense, multiple devices, cumbersome sometimes, but I have to say useful. And creating now that link between the home and the clinic. And really, if you think about it, this would be, in a sense, a hospital at home. Next. However, we see the future to be even better than this. We see the future, especially with the adoption of these sensors and wearables. Now these sensors aggregate or can detect multiple things at the same time. So you can replace these multiple devices into one. And I bring an analogy a little bit to Steve Jobs when he really introduced that smartphone. He replaced, what did he do? He did the phone, he got a music player, and then obviously connecting to the internet, all in one single device. So we are starting to get there. However, today we have 900 devices available. They are starting to be used a lot worldwide. I mean, in the United States, we project that about 20% of people have actually one form of these devices that are being used on a regular basis. It is not, I would say I am different. I actually use all these devices at the same time. I like to measure everything that is happening in my life, when I exercise, when I eat. But I think we want this to be the normal way rather than the odd way, the way I'm doing it. Next. And we expect this to be extremely useful. And I want to give a tangible example. And I learned this from my cardiology colleagues trying to treat chronic, heart failure. Chronic heart failure can be managed if it's monitored closely. However, many times today, it is, if the patient is not closely monitored, the patient situation will worsen. And this will lead to obviously hospitalization, lead to increased cost, and it leads to, maybe mortality or morbidity. There have been now adoption of these continuous monitoring, simple devices, starting simple always, because it's difficult in healthcare to move to disrupt it too much. But if you equip a congestive heart patient with a weight scale that they can measure, and that information can be given to the doctor, other sensors such as heart rate and blood pressure, now the cardiologist is going to be able to better manage that patient. That's going to lead to their decompensation and picked up early and treated. This not only is going to save life, but it's also going to save a lot of cost in terms of managing that patient. Next. We at Mount Sinai, again, have been leader in the adoption of these wearables and the integration of commercially available wearables with our home in-house app to interact with. We have done work during COVID time to try to detect the infection of COVID 1 week before somebody is symptomatic. We have measured the stress exposure, as Phil was talking about. We can measure it with these apps and with these wearables, and we did that in our healthcare workers. And we've also measured, what is the resilience of these healthcare workers from the parameters and the predictive models that we have built using these wearables. And we've also launched therapy. It's launched actually intervention to manage the stress with different techniques. And this way we can see if these 24-hour monitoring with these intervention, how can we lower somebody's stress? And finally, we are investing in the next generation, and I'm really proud of that. Thank you to the leadership, to Dr. Charney and others, to be able to do novel wearables. And these are called Skintronic or skin tattoos, extremely powerful, that can be etched on your body and can measure a variety of things never imagined before. And the microfabrication, rather than relying on outside people, will be done here at Mount Sinai. Next. Okay, so I finish with this and I'm happy to entertain questions.
So I have a question. So there's a lot of wearables on the market.
Yep.
And it's almost like a tsunami of wearables.
Absolutely.
How do you decide which wearables are valid?
Mhm.
Which wearables should, somebody who is not, being connected to a doctor, but they just want to have a wearable where they can monitor things, by themselves. So what's the current state and where do you see things going?
So that's a very good question, Dennis. And I think it really points out to the issue that we have in healthcare in the adoption of these wearables. These wearables have been introduced to the market really from the aspect of the consumer, thinking about casual use rather than use in healthcare. However, there have been a few studies, and I think Apple with their Apple Watch and some have shown, and they have done clinical trials in large amount of patients and people, that they can detect certain features, related to heart rate and to potentially arrhythmias. But I do think that these devices, although useful recreationally, they still need to undergo incredible validation. I really think they need to be all redesigned. And that's why we embark at Mount Sinai to be involved in that, to try to redesign the best wearables for use in healthcare and in cardiology. And that's really is what we're aiming for.
There's a question from the audience who asks, are there clinical trials related to wearables, and how could one participate in one?
I don't know currently if there's any open clinical trial, but Apple actually have conducted two major ones. One early on when they introduced the Apple Watch to look at the heart rate, and then a follow-up one later. So again, I think the commercial vendors, are not best suited, honestly, to create a healthcare, device according to Dr. Fuster's standard, for example, right? So that's why I do think we are going to see in the future, companies, including us at Mount Sinai, producing these devices totally tailored to the use and for our patients.
I can add something, Dennis.
Sure.
There are 3 trials going on for the detection of an arrhythmia, atrial fibrillation at this moment,
Exactly.
in people who are at a high risk.
Yeah.
Why? Because this is a rhythm disturbance. The first manifestation may be a stroke. Yeah. So it's important to know if one has silent atrial fibrillation, but only in people at high risk. In people at low risk has not worked out. Exactly. These are the 2 trials that actually he mentioned. That's but correct, there are trials going on.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
And Dr. Fuster, this may go to you. This is another question from the audience. How important or useful are implanted devices that monitor the heart?
Are very important in people at high risk. We have, for example, the linked recorder under the skin, which you record every day, every night, and you really, over a period of time, a month, 2 months, 3 months, you can know if the fact that one day you fainted was related to a rhythm disturbance. And we see these patients all the time. So I think that the wearables that are carried constantly to monitor somebody at risk is the way to go today. And there is the link recorder is a clear example in those who already had a fainting attack, and we don't know exactly related to what, whether it was a rhythm disturbance or was not. And the wearables help.
So here's another question, whether it's for you, Valentin, or Zahi. What do you think of the Watchman for atrial fibrillation patients?
We already talked about it exactly. When you say patients, I hope you say people at high risk. The Watchman for people at low risk have shown no effect. And these are the 2 trials he mentioned. But the people at high risk, who are the people at high risk? Those who have palpitations and they don't know why, those who have fainting, and for example, they don't know why, These are the
Yeah.
people who really can be very helpful. I don't know, Sahi, if you have any other
I
comments.
mean, again, I mean, maybe a little bit, put a little thing into context. I mean, this is an implantable device. This is an invasive technique. So of course, I think you, as Dr. Fuster said, it will be useful only in people that are at risk. So in the future, I hope, that we can adopt these wearables if they are well validated and they will be used in low risk people, but we still need to do these validation. So the two different categories, right, Dr. Fuster, in terms of what patient you do and what do you go invasive or not? Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions related to aspirin. To summarize them, what is the considered, is there efficacy supporting using aspirin to support cardiovascular health? What's the current status of aspirin?
Not good. Cardiovascular health in people who are healthy, unless they have 3 or 4 of the 7 risk factors we mentioned, aspirin, to take aspirin just for the sake of taking, the chances of having a bleed are much higher than preventing a stroke. So I think it's very, very important, this question. Please take aspirin if you really are at a high risk. Who is at a high risk? Those who already had a heart attack or a stroke, or those who actually have a large number of risk factors that have not been able to actually modify. Otherwise, it's a mistake.
Thank you on that one. Here's another wearable question. Zahi, I don't know if this is one for you. What is the timeline for diabetic wearables, such as smart contacts and insulin patches?
Yeah, this is a very good question. And actually, I have played myself around with them. And these are the continuous glucose monitors where there's a tiny little needle, that you could put as a patch on your armrest, and then it will last almost 2 weeks, etc. I have played with it myself just to see how does my glucose spike after I eat certain type of food, and how does my glucose spike when I exercise and do other activities. So I do think that we are going to see better technology with some wearables in the future. And I think it's very important to measure that if you can measure it accurately at 24 hours. Yeah.
Okay, now thank you. Here's a diet question. Anybody who knows the answer can jump in on this one. Regarding diets, any comments about vegetarian, vegan, ketonic diets?
I don't know if I can.
Anybody prefer one versus the other?
I would answer the question by having the reality that every diet that you mention has a negative. Proteins may be affected, aspects can be affected, and so forth. The vegetarian diet has a lot of favorable aspects on this. But the most important thing is what we call a balanced diet. And to me, the balanced diet is the Mediterranean diet. And a diet that really takes care of all what we need. And I don't have to describe what kind of diet with vegetables and fruits and so forth. But to me, that's what it is. At the moment you go to an extreme, you're playing an extreme risk too. And this is what is coming out from these specific diets that you mentioned.
Philip, there's a sleep question. You mentioned the importance of sleep on cardiovascular health. Any recommendations on improving sleep?
Be regular. That's the key. So thing to do is to as much as you can go to sleep at the same time, regardless of the day of the week. I know it's difficult because we tend to want to maybe go to sleep a little later on the weekends, but by and large, the best thing that you can do for your sleep health is to keep your sleep regular. Now, everyone has a different sleep need. This is what we call a chronotype. Some people require more sleep than others. And so if that's a personal thing that one should know for themselves, but the key is, unfortunately for those of us who travel a lot and experience jet lag, this is difficult. But I think this is the key thing to do, is to keep it regular.
Thank you. This could go to Zahid. Another question from the audience. Please tell us about the new heart MRI.
I mean, I don't know exactly what they're referring to, but obviously there have been a lot of advances in the use of MRI for looking at the heart, for looking at the vasculature. Imaging can be done extremely fast and even with devices. I don't know, Dr. Fuster, is this related to heart flow, but heart flow, or is it, or it's related to, I don't know.
I interpret the question that MRI may be used in the heart in certain circumstances which can be dangerous, like devices and so forth, which is not dangerous.
No, exactly.
Hand, which is not. I mean, we can use it now openly, but can be also be directed to the role of MRI on the heart, which is evolving rapidly. MRI, as you know, and you're an expert, is the technology today that doesn't have a ceiling, can continue to improve. The timing is being shorter and shorter, and I think can characterize the tissue. And I think to me is the dream of all the imaging technologies when we look towards the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, one last question, and then we'll wrap up. What is the role of Plavix after receiving a stent?
Well, the role of Plavix after receiving a stent, let me tell you, there are two phases. One is up until 7 years ago, and the other is from the last 7 years. Up to 7 years ago, it was absolutely essential to use Plavix and aspirin, for example, after a stent to prevent blood clots. What happened in the last few years is the stents are actually much safer. There is much less clotting. And then the question is, do you use aspirin or do you use Plavix, and for how long? So the use of aspirin and Plavix has been given shorter and shorter. But Plavix is one of the most efficient antithrombotics that you can use, but not necessarily now you use it in combination with aspirin for a long time. It's decreasing because the degree of clotting is much less. It's a very good drug, it's a safe drug to use, and it can be used alone in a majority of patients because the degree of clotting is small with the recent device, with the recent stents.
And should aspirin be used after stenting?
Aspirin is being used after stenting, and now even alone after the first month in patients who are not at a very high risk. So aspirin, I don't like to say aspirin is better or worse than Plavix, but both are being used independently and less in combination than it was in the past. Clotting is much less problem.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up. I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Fuster, Dr. Svirsky, Dr. Murad, and Dr. Fayed. Want to thank you all for attending today's webinar. If you feel inspired, and I hope you do, to help Mount Sinai in leading the way in terms of providing the best cardiac care and research, please find it in your heart, I can't believe I said that, to support the VF 100 campaign. There's a special code that you can see that is now on the screen, and just point your smart phone camera at it, and it will take you to a web page where you can make a donation if you wish. At this point, I'd like to ask Dr. Fuster for any final thoughts he might have. Dr. Fuster.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Well, first of all, I have worked in very top institutions, and the dream of Mount Sinai today, I think, is verbalized very clearly in the last hour and a half, and that is a dream to be working integrated with the people who made their presentations. We are all working together. And this is something I have to say, Dennis, you have achieved in a way that I have not seen in any other institution. and that is the high quality of people working together. All of us who presented today are completely unified. We are attacking a problem which is the #1 killer from different avenues in the best way we can. And this is very motivating. In fact, each of us are looking now at health. Can we maintain health? Can we promote health? And we talk about less about disease. So this is extremely motivating. And that is, I think we all have in mind to make a better world with higher quality of life in people, addressing this cardiovascular disease as the #1 killer. And when I talk about motivation with working with the group of the people that I mentioned today and part of the Mount Sinai philosophy, I have to say that we also like to obviously to motivate the audience to be supportive of us because, life is a give and take, and that is all of us can contribute in one way or another, and we try to help each other. So I really appreciate the support that the audience today in this particular session may contribute. But again, the most important message I want to give is that thank you very much, Dennis. It is a dream to work here.
Thank you for those kind comments. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the audience. Everybody, be safe. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.